Here is a yo-yo. Let's say it took an hour to make, parts and everything. And here's a bag of high fructose jelly beans. Let's say they took 20 minutes to make. What if they both sold for $5 despite having different labor contents? Wouldn't this be a big problem for Marx's value theory? When people get their panties in a bunch about price and value, it's over this issue of price and value not being the same all the time. Is this non-identity of value and price the end of Marx and the end of all radical politics? I hope not. After all, the reason we have two concepts, value and price, is because they are not the same. It is the relation between them that counts. It is the relation between them that explains the inner mechanisms of capitalist production and exchange. If value and price were the same, we would automatically know how much labor went into a commodity and what level of output we needed to meet society's demand. But if we already knew all of these things, then there would be no need to have value or price or even a market for that matter. We could just plan everything on a computer. But we don't have a planned economy. How much yo-yos and jelly beans should society produce? How much of society's labor time should go into each? Nobody knows. And when the capitalist buys plastic and string and hires yo-yo makers, she doesn't know how much profit she'll make. And when we go to the store, we can't see how much work went into our yo-yos and jelly beans. These decisions all must happen through the fluctuation of price signals. These fluctuations reflect back upon production to discipline and apportion labor. When we say that labor is disciplined, we mean that Joe Schmo on the jelly bean assembly line is pushed to work at the average level of productivity. On the shop floor, he is pushed by the speed of the machine and his boss. But the machine and his boss are being pushed by competition in the market to lower the socially necessary labor time it takes to make jelly beans. When we say that labor is apportioned, we are talking about how many people work at the jelly bean factory and how many work at the yo-yo factory and so on. In other words, we are talking about the division of labor. The division of labor and the socially necessary labor time determine what is produced, how much is produced, and what the values between these commodities are. But the unique thing about capitalism is that these decisions about disciplining and apportioning labor only happen after the labor has been performed. Price signals are judgments on past labor, which then influence future labor. As the products of labor leave production, enter circulation, and then become inputs into future production, we have a continual feedback loop of information. This feedback loop could be confusing unless we remember this important principle. Value cannot be created in exchange. Once you understand this, almost everything else falls into place. Value is created in production by human labor. It takes the form of commodities with definite values. Commodities enter the marketplace where they acquire prices. Sometimes these prices are above their values, sometimes below. These signals act back upon production to discipline and apportion labor. Thus, the enormous complex division of labor in a capitalist society is coordinated through the value relations between the commodities. Because value cannot be created in exchange, this means that the exchange of commodities is a zero-sum game. If some commodities sell above values, then others must sell below. There can be no aggregate increase in value merely through the process of commodities changing owners. To have new value, there must be new labor. Unlike neoclassical theory, where prices arise merely from the collision of subjective motivations of individuals bartering, totally abstracting away from the production process, the Marxist theory of value and price directly links these phenomena to the need for society to reproduce itself through a capitalist division of labor. Yo-yos don't walk around with 1 hour of labor written all over them. We only know the social value of a yo-yo through its money price. This is what we mean when we say that price is the form of appearance of value. Price is the visible, tangible form that value takes in the world. We only see the relations between laborers through the exchange ratios of commodities. Now, money is the god of all commodities. It is the one commodity that all other commodities measure their value in. Thus, price is a very special type of exchange value. Prices represent value in the abstract. They are measures of abstract labor. Thus, when the price of a jelly bean rises above its value, this means that the jelly bean commands more money than its value, that it commands more abstract labor in exchange than it required in production. If value can't be created in exchange, this means that the total amount of value produced is always equal to the total prices of those commodities. But individual values and prices can and must diverge in order for the price mechanism to discipline and apportion labor. One of the main reasons that prices deviate from values is the constant fluctuations of demand and supply. As capital revolutionizes the productivity of labor, values change, output and prices change, and demand and supply fluctuate. If demand for jelly beans is higher than the supply, then the prices of jelly beans rise above their values. They command more abstract labor in exchange, and this triggers a reapportioning of labor to bring supply in line with demand. In the case of a monopoly, supply is kept artificially low so that prices rise and the monopolists get extra profit. If the supply and demand of yo-yos, jelly beans, and all other commodities magically balanced, then prices would actually equal values. But if this was the case, we wouldn't have much need for price. We'd automatically know how much labor input went into anything we demanded, and we could just organize everything on a computer without a market. Sometimes people think that profit comes from unequal exchange. This can be true for individuals, but not for society as a whole, because value cannot be created in exchange. One person's loss is another's gain. In order for there to be an aggregate increase in society's profit, there must be exploitation of workers for surplus value. In order to not confuse the isolated individual profits that can occur from unequal exchange with the surplus value generated from exploiting workers, Marx often suggests that we imagine that values equal prices. This simplification allows us to more easily see the origin of surplus value. This does not mean that Marx actually thinks that prices always equal value, or even that they gravitate toward that state over the long run. In fact, he says just the opposite, that demand and supply rarely meet, and that prices and values are rarely the same. Marx's argument about surplus value, and all of his other conclusions as well, are totally valid whether or not values equal price. Sometimes people think that by pointing to value-price divergences, they have somehow undermined the theory of surplus value. But this is an error, because the theory of surplus value does not require prices to always equal values. Before we move on, we should review the main points thus far. Value cannot be created in exchange, only moved around in exchange. Money is the measure of value. If a commodity sells above its value, this is the same as saying that it commands more labor in exchange than the labor that went into it. I haven't been to a yo-yo factory, but I picture an assembly line of people wrapping string around yo-yos. But this isn't all of the labor that goes into a yo-yo. Before any of this labor can commence, materials must be purchased. String, plastic, molds, paint, and all of those inputs come from past labor processes elsewhere in the world. Every labor process has new active labor, which Marx calls living labor, and inputs from past labor, which Marx calls dead labor. Dead labor cannot create value. The cost of purchasing inputs like string and plastic is passed on to the output prices of yo-yos, but no new value comes from this labor because it's already done laboring. Living labor creates the new value. The worker creates the value of their wage so that the capitalist makes back their investment. The worker also performs surplus labor for the capitalist. This is surplus value. At the beginning of the day, the capitalist lays out money for inputs and wages. This is her cost of production. If she wants to continue to make yo-yos tomorrow, she will need to make back enough money to buy inputs and wages tomorrow. Thus, prices are inherently tied to the need for the system to reproduce itself. She also needs an incentive to invest. This is profit. Thus, prices are inherently tied to the need for capital to exploit labor. The capitalist doesn't lay out anything for surplus value. This she acquires from the worker for free. That's why it's called exploitation. But the profit capitalists get from selling their commodities is not always equal to the surplus value they've produced. If the prices of commodities rise above their values, then, when they are sold, the capitalist's profit is higher than the surplus value contained in the product. Surplus value has been transferred in exchange. I started by saying that price and value are not equal because they were different concepts. Now, we can add that surplus value and profit are not always equal because they represent different concepts as well. Surplus value can only be created in production, but it can be redistributed in exchange. If a capitalist profit is higher than the surplus value they create in production, we call this super profit. As we discussed in the video on socially necessary labor time, super profits are the prime motivating force of a capitalist economy. They drive innovation and attract investment. They are a necessary part of capitalist competition. Now, if you really want to talk about surplus value being redistributed in exchange, then you have to talk about prices of production. It starts with a puzzle. Let's say jelly beans just take a tiny bit of living labor compared to all the dead labor that goes into the inputs. You basically buy a lot of sugar, corn syrup, and dye, and then you hire one person to push some buttons in a factory while machines turn that sugar into beans. But let's say that yo-yos take a lot more labor in comparison. You buy a little bit of plastic and string, and then you have to hire people to make the plastic molds, paint the yo-yos, and then let's not forget how long it takes to wind up a yo-yo. So the two industries have different proportions of living to dead labor. Since the yo-yo factory has a higher proportion of living labor, we can assume that the yo-yo factory must produce more surplus value than the jelly bean factory. More workers means more value, means more surplus value. We'd expect the yo-yo factory to be more profitable. But then there's also this phenomenon called average profits. This is where the puzzle comes in. If capital is free to invest in any industry, free to move in search of the highest profits, this causes a tendency for profit rates to equalize. Jelly bean makers start to invest in the yo-yo industry, cutting into their profit margins. Capital flows from one industry to the other. Supply and demand change, prices change. Eventually, assuming the free flow of capital, jelly bean makers and yo-yo makers enjoy the same average rate of profit. Now you see the puzzle. One industry produces more surplus value than the other, but they have the same rate of profit. How can this be? If we remember that value cannot be created in exchange, and that surplus value cannot be created in exchange, then we can easily solve the puzzle. First, we note the following two principles. Total prices equal total values, and total surplus value equals total profit. And so the answer to our riddle is this. Surplus value is redistributed between capitalists in exchange to form an average rate of profit. That should seem simple enough since we've already discussed the redistribution of value in exchange. How do capitalists redistribute surplus value? Did they send it to each other in the mail? No. Prices do this work of redistribution. The prices for some commodities fall, others rise, and thus capitalists gain and lose surplus value in exchange in a way that equalizes profit rates. In this way, surplus value becomes less of the property of the individual capitalist and more the property of the capitalist class as a whole, uniting the class in their common interest in the exploitation of labor. These new prices, the prices which redistribute surplus value to form an average rate of profit, Marx calls prices of production. Prices of production systematically deviate from values, yet they are directly related to values. The total level of surplus value created determines the amount of value that can be redistributed to form these new prices of production. In addition, the tendency towards an average rate of profit is merely a tendency. Just as supply and demand fluctuate, never balancing, so do profit rates. So we see several different factors to keep in mind when discussing price. If there is no equalization of profit rates, and demand and supply are in balance, then we can say that value equals price. If we assume a perfect equalization of profit rates, and supply and demand are in balance, then we can say that prices equal prices of production. If we then let supply and demand fluctuate around these prices of production, we get market prices. Sometimes Marx just talks about value. Sometimes he talks about prices of production. And sometimes he talks about market price. These are three different levels of abstraction. Many mistakes have been made by people not paying attention to what level of abstraction is currently being discussed. Bohm-Bawerk, for instance, complained that in one place Marx said that value equals price, but in another place said that prices of production equal price. He thought Marx was contradicting himself. But had Bohm-Bawerk been interested in actually reading Marx a little more closely, he might have realized that Marx's analysis takes place on many levels of abstraction, that we must keep all these levels in mind at all times if we want to understand what's really going on. We should also keep in mind that Marx's central conclusions about exploitation, crisis, and all the other antagonisms of a capitalist society still hold, whether we are talking about value, price of production, or market price. Regardless of the level of abstraction, value can't be created in exchange, and surplus value can only come from the exploitation of the working class. We can only conclude that Marx gives us a quite robust and practical explanation of the way that commodity exchange regulates the reproduction of a capitalist division of labor and class relations. There's definitely a lot more to say on the topic, and a number of controversies to examine. On my WordPress blog, you can find footnotes and references pointing you to more information and resources on this topic.
And now we can see how radically different Marx's theory of price is from his neoclassical critics. For neoclassical economics, price is a reflection of equilibrium, of a state of rest where all utilities are maximized. For Marx, price formation is a ceaseless process of fluctuation that is part of a much larger process of value formation and distribution, as capitalists compete to exploit workers better than their competitors, thus constantly revolutionizing the technological basis of society. From Marx's theory of price, we can immediately move to a theory of capitalist crisis. Because the tendency toward an average profit rate redistributes value between industries, there's no way to keep firms from investing more and more in machines and less in workers. In fact, the race for super profit compels capitalists to decrease socially necessary labor time by spending more on machines to make workers more efficient. This means that while individual capitalists race to increase their own super profit, that over time, the average profit rate of the economy as a whole falls. The worker finds herself confronted with a greater and greater mass of machinery, while the capitalist class finds itself getting a lower and lower rate of return on larger and larger investments. The time is right for crisis.